Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith. Tonight, the first man to be diagnosed with Ebola in the DR Congolese city of Goma dies. It's a worrying development as the country races to contain the spread of an epidemic that's killed 1,600 since last August. Also, the British-born South African pop star Johnny Clegg passes away. Known as the White Zulu, his band and music defied the racial segregation of apartheid, calling out the injustices of white majority rule. And things are on the up for Tunisia's tourism sector. The number of French tourists heading over on holiday sees a 23% hike, and the government's hopeful investment can tempt back even more visitors. But first, the first Ebola patient in Goma during DR Congo's latest outbreak of the disease has died. The case was described as a game changer by the World Health Organization's chief, since it is the first in a major city since the latest emergency began back in August. 1,600 people have died of Ebola since then. The patient was an evangelical preacher who'd traveled back from Butembo. It's one of the towns currently hardest hit by Ebola. The WHO has called an emergency meeting for Wednesday to consider stepping up the global response to the outbreak. The organization's regional emergencies director earlier told me that despite the urgency, Goma had been prepared in advance.
We consider Goma in operation mode since 6 months ago. We started planning teams on surveillance, on contact tracing, rapid response. You know, Ebola is a dangerous disease. When you have one case, it can be a risk for many people. That's why we are very serious on what we are doing, making sure that all contacts are identified, not only in Goma, but throughout the itinerary of the pastor, because he traveled from Beni to Butembo and then to Goma. So it's a very serious situation, but we are taking all the necessary action to contain it. So we keep sharing information with Rwanda and all countries. So what is important is really to continue reinforcing point of entry screening and to make sure that any case can be detected at those point of entry. The emergency committee is called by the Director General of WHO anytime we have a particular event. The last time was when we had cases in Uganda, and this time because of Goma being a big city and the population movement, it's important to get advice from WHO experts on whether the situation is a public health event of international concern or not. But it's not specifically related to the death of the pastor, but to the situation in Goma. It's almost 1 year we have been fighting Ebola in North Kivu and Ituri, and it is a very complex situation because of the security challenges, because of the difficult access to certain places. But the teams are still committed, and we really need international support to continue this fight to make sure that the vulnerable population will be protected and will preserve the international health security. I think it's extremely important.
Ibrahim Masosefal there speaking to me a little earlier on. Now, in Nigeria, emergency workers worked against the clock on Tuesday trying to find survivors of a building collapse in Jos. At least 13 people were killed when the 3-story residential building collapsed on Monday night in the central city. The structure crumbled after 3 days of heavy rain. Locals claimed that extra floors had been added over the last 2 years. Former South African President Jacob Zuma said that he and his family received death threats after his first day of testimony at a judicial inquiry into corruption allegedly committed under his leadership. Tuesday was day 2 of the investigation in Johannesburg. He denies doing anything wrong. Witnesses accuse him of having allowed the wealthy Gupta family to unduly influence the operation of the state and giving them access to state funds and assets. Zuma's 9-year tenure ended when he was ousted by the ANC last year. Now, he was known as the White Zulu. South African Johnny Clegg passed away aged 66 in Johannesburg on Tuesday. He'd been battling pancreatic cancer for several years. Clegg shot to international fame for defying apartheid and playing in multiracial bands during white majority rule. His hits drew on Zulu and black South African culture and confronted some of the injustices of apartheid. Jane Flanagan joins us now with more. Jane, so what did he mean to people in South Africa?
Well, Johnny Clegg's music, I suppose, is the soundtrack to the lives of many South Africans, whether they're white or black. He really epitomized a South African, whatever color they are. I suppose he envisaged a rainbow nation long before anyone had thought of that. I interviewed him once, and he said that he never set out to be a political activist or a musical activist. Politics sort of found him. He just had a natural curiosity about the other in South Africa, and during apartheid, his natural curiosity about other people's music and other people's lives just drew him into townships, into the hostels, and putting himself at some personal risk. But just the pull of exploring just was too great for him. And he wasn't just a musician; he was also an academic, an anthropologist who taught at some of the universities. Just a very, very fully rounded person who will be deeply missed. My timeline on my social media tonight is really full of just an incredible outpouring of grief and affection for him that I don't think we've seen in South Africa since the death of Nelson Mandela.
The end wasn't exactly a surprise. He did learn of his diagnosis quite a few years back. And once he did, he went on this huge worldwide tour, you managing to catch his concert in Cape Town. But bearing in mind that he was ill, why do you think he would take on such a huge undertaking as a world tour at a time like that?
Well, I think he just loved performing. He loved live performances. It was the best way for him to connect with people. He really, his shows were so full and so energetic. He packed so much into it. And he said that as soon as he realized that his time was numbered, the only thing he really wanted to stay well for was to go on one last farewell tour. And he went round the world, taking on dozens and dozens of concert venues. I mean, he wasn't just popular with South Africans or the South African diaspora or even the African diaspora. He had fans on every single continent, and he made sure that he gave them all an incredible last show. And he took his son Jesse with him. He's also a very successful musician in South Africa. And he also took some of the figures from his earlier life in music, and what an incredible legacy he's left to South Africans. Such great songs, such optimism for the future of this country, and I think people will hold that very close now, thinking about him.
Thanks very much. Jane Flanagan there on the death of Johnny Clegg. Now, the number of French tourists heading to Tunisia on holiday this year is up by 23%. The country's tourism sector had recently taken a hit by a number of terror attacks, but the government's hoping to change all that and has plans to ramp up investment to tempt over millions more of visitors a year. Take a look.
In Tunisia's south, responsible ecotourism also means making the most of the countryside, like in Nefta in the heart of an oasis. Open during the revolution, even when others closed because tourism was down, this hotel has invested in Tunisian nature and local craftsmanship.
Here we're in the pilotis room, and as you can see, we only use local products. That's palm wood, which we made with craftsmen from Nefta. Here we trained young people to make pure wool blankets, and the sheets were also made by artisans in Djerba.
Even the shampoo is homemade. A natural spring pool distributes water to the vegetable garden. These Belgian tourists are discovering an entirely different Tunisia.
It's not the mass tourism which we're familiar with. It's a hotel centered around nature and which is respectful of its natural environment.
Tourism conscious of the environment and waste. For now, this alternative hotel experience isn't publicly advertised. It still doesn't have its registration. So far, the country has only about 50 businesses registered under the relatively new category of guest houses.
I would say there is an important market which is growing, let's say unofficially, quite simply because no one is helping them register with the right documents for their new business.
But this lack of support isn't discouraging Tunisians in areas deserted by tourists. This farmer in Tunisia's north began the construction of an ecodome, an ecological curiosity, to attract tourists to visit his region.
In ecotourism, everyone has their specialty. There are those who make sheep milk cheese, others who highlight archaeological ruins like in Douga. I chose the ecodome, an ecological house made with sandbags.
This living space has already drawn the interest of Chinese businessmen who have come to taste local delicacies and discover the surroundings. Hamdi is hoping to attract both local and foreign customers this year.
That report by our correspondent in Tunisia. Well, that's all we have time for, but we will leave you with the sounds of one of Johnny Clegg's most best-known songs, Asim Bonanga, which means we've never seen him. It was released in 1987 in protest over the quarter of a century the late president and anti-apartheid icon Nelson Mandela spent in prison. Mandela wasn't released until 1990. That's it. Thanks for joining us. Do so again. Take care.